What's up, everyone? Welcome back to C&D Sports. Today we start our new off-season series. Now that the MLB off-season is just getting started, the hot stove's heating up. So we've got some analysis on some teams that we think are prepared for some interesting off-seasons ahead of them. So let's start right now with the Toronto Blue Jays. This was a 90-plus win ball club that didn't make the postseason last year. A lot of changes could potentially be made. A lot of guys could or could not be brought back. So a lot of question marks here. So I think the best place to start here is to look at the assets that they already have and what they're building around. So obviously, they've got the Hank Aaron Award winner this year in Vlad Guerrero Jr., an MVP candidate this year. If I had to pick MVP, he'd be my MVP. No disrespect to Shohei Ohtani, but I just like the work that Vlad did this year. And then they have Bo Bichette, Lourdes Gurriel, George Springer, and Teoscar Hernandez as the key pieces in terms of starting offense for them.
Yeah.
Danny Jansen's another guy that I think we'll touch on why he's not necessarily a key asset for me, but an asset nonetheless. Danny Jansen's going to be in the fold, whether that's in a platoon role catching, whether that's the backup catcher. Danny Jansen, I think the closing stretch of the year, he earned that spot to stick on this roster with such a team. With a team that's so deep with catchers, when you had Reese McGuire and Alejandro Kirk also playing into that catching role. And then Randall Grichik is a guy that an 80 RBI guy last year that certainly mean with him being so good, it certainly means the Jays don't have to go out and look for an outfielder like they had to last year when they acquired George Springer. Santiago Espinal is another guy at third base who he filled in well at third base, which is certainly something they need to look into this year. He filled in well, but he's not going to be. You can't have him as your everyday third baseman if you are trying to make a World Series push like they are. But Santiago Espinal will certainly be an asset in the fold next season. We'll move to the pitching side here. They've got a good solid three in their rotation right now, in Jose Barrios, Alek Manoah, and Hyunjin Ryu. You certainly would like to bring a guy like Robbie Ray back. Maybe go out and look for other top-end talent, but overall a good place to start right there with those three. And then in the bullpen's got good bones right now, with Jordan Romano, Adam Simber, Nate Pearson, and Ross Stripling being the key righties. In the bullpen, Tim Meza being a key lefty. I think they could use some more kind of in-your-face talent. So that big end relief talent towards the back of the bullpen, it's something they've struggled with. But they just need to beef up that bullpen, but they've already got a good start, good bones for them right now. And then we'll move to prospects on the rise. And I mentioned Danny Jansen, kind of the ambiguity in terms of where he's going to be next year and what role he's going to play. And it's because of the play of Gabriel Moreno in the minors, as he's probably their biggest prospect on the rise to this point. I think this is a guy that if he has a good spring, I think this guy next year is going to be on the roster. Whether it's opening day or not remains to be seen, but I think Gabriel Moreno is a guy that with a good spring, he could contend for the starting role at catcher, as he's going to be he's one of the best catching prospects in baseball right now and could be one of the best young catchers in baseball for years to come. Other guys that can fill roles, the shortstop third base combo in Jordan Groshans and Kevin Smith. We saw Kevin Smith up last year for a bit to kind of fill in here and there with injuries. Jordan Groshans obviously being a first-round pick himself. There's a lot more potential there. I don't think he necessarily is their solution at third base, which again I think is a big need for them. But he is an option there for them and an option for the future. Otto Lopez, a good utility option. And then good guys that can play kind of spot roles in that bullpen if needed in Joey Murray and Bowden Francis. Those would probably be the biggest prospects on the rise, but none bigger than Gabriel Moreno, obviously, as I think he's the only one that's going to compete for a starting role in that lineup next year. So then we move to their key targets this year. And as I've outlined, third base is probably their biggest need right now. They're going to need a couple of pitchers for the starting rotation. And then obviously some bullpen help. And so we'll start off with the Jays are an interesting team because they have two of the best players in baseball as free agents this year, and an MVP candidate at second base in Marcus Semien. And their key lefty starter that will likely win the AL Cy Young this year in Robbie Ray. Those are two guys that, in my opinion, you need to get back.
Yeah.
And they are key pieces in this lineup, in this rotation. So obviously, those are your priorities right off the bat.
Yep.
And then we move into their key needs. And I think third base, like I've said, is their biggest need. So Matt Chapman being available for trade as Oakland looks to go into a rebuild. He's a guy that can fill out a middle of the order 5 to 7 spot in the lineup. Good power, a platinum glove winner at third base. So you upgrade defensively there. Another guy who maybe is certainly not as good on defense as Matt Chapman, but as good on offense as Kyle Seager, the longtime Mariner. The Mariners declined his options, so he is on the market. I think he's a guy like Matt Chapman, can fit into that 5 to 7 role, can handle that. He can really handle. He can handle his own defensively there. Chris Taylor's another guy that could be an option at third base, and he can play everywhere, outfield, second base. He's played time at short. I think he's a little bit of a long shot. I think he's going back to the Dodgers, but Chris Taylor's a guy that's going to gauge a lot of interest now that he's a free agent, so we'll see where he goes. And kind of a more frugal option here would be Eduardo Escobar, who has silently put together solid season after solid season, a lot of power, can play multiple infield positions, has played third base consistently for at least a few seasons of his career. So Eduardo Escobar, again, is a cheaper option. And then I think the best replacement, if they can't get Marcus Semien back, I would look to a guy like Cesar Hernandez, who will certainly demand less money and less term than Marcus Semien, but is a guy that, he plays adequately. He was a fairly big get for the White Sox at the trade deadline. Overall, I think he played a little better before he got to the White Sox, but again, a solid everyday guy that if you lose Semien, you can at least replace some of what Semien was with a guy like Hernandez. Another guy, they don't necessarily have a DH, and Nelson Cruz was a guy they were looking at the trade deadline last year. Nelson Cruz would be an interesting option for a one-year deal to get some more power in that lineup. Jose Ramirez, who has said he wants to play his entire career in Cleveland. I put him on this list, though, because they were fairly close to acquiring him at the trade deadline. They had an offer in place for them. Obviously, Cleveland didn't pull the trigger on it. But Jose Ramirez is a guy that certainly would be a huge get at third base, would immediately insert into the middle of that lineup. I think Ross Atkins and Mark Shapiro are certainly going to look at that option, whether it's there or not. And probably my most interesting proposal this is, I guess, my wild proposal for this team, would be to go after Matt Olson. And I know Matt Olson is a first baseman, and you already have Vlad, but when you have a team like Oakland that is really going through a fire sale right now, I think you have to at least look at the fact that there's an all-star on the table, and he's a guy that I think there's still a lot of question marks around Vlad's defense at first base, but not his bat. And I think he's a guy that you may look at the option to platoon him at first base, give Vlad, both of them would be in the lineup every day, of course, but at least try to switch it up a bit, that you have both their bats in the lineup, both of them on defense every now and then, so both of them continue to grow on defense. But I think Matt Olson is just a guy that I've really liked watching in Oakland, and I think he's a guy that is certainly going to gauge a lot of interest, and I think he really fits the traditional Jays mold of a lot of power hitters. So then we move on to pitching here, and obviously they need starters. A guy that I left off this list was Steven Matz, who they had last year, who they offered a multi-year deal to. He rejected it. He wants to go to free agency. Steven Matz is a guy I could see coming back, but I think there's a lot better options than Steven Matz and a lot more intriguing options. So Kevin Gausman and Marcus Stroman are probably the guys that I think could get solid multi-year deals. Carlos Radon is another guy as well. Obviously, it would be a reunion for Stroman. Kevin Gausman would be coming back to the AL East. Those, I think, are kind of the top gets that would probably command 5-year deals. Both of them came off of spectacular years. Gausman was a dark horse for the Cy Young, obviously didn't finish as a top 3 finalist, but Kevin Gausman would be huge for that rotation if they could land him. Carlos Rodon is coming off of a great year with the White Sox, and I think he's another guy that you add another lefty to the fold. Hopefully you can get Robbie Ray back, and he could serve as a third lefty to pair with Hyunjin Ryu. I like Radon. There's a lot of injury issues with him in the past, but I think Radon is a solid get. And then we have two veterans here, in Justin Verlander and Max Scherzer, who Scherzer, you can argue, is still in his prime right now, being a Cy Young finalist again this year. Justin Verlander is just a few years removed from being one of the top pitchers in the league right now. Both of which I don't think are going to command long term, considering that they are towards the end of their career. And I think Verlander is probably the more interesting get, just because he probably won't command as much money as well for a team that does have to consider saving up money for a lot of young contracts that they have to pay out. I think Verlander would be an interesting kind of why not option.
Yep.
And Max Scherzer would obviously, you'd have to show him the money, but not as much as you would, because again, he is towards the end of his career. Those are two top end guys, at least Verlander, a former top end guy that are going to gauge a lot of interest, and I think the Jays will probably kick the tires on, because they've said they're going to be aggressive. And then we'll move to the bullpen here as the last spot. Two guys at the top here in Raisel Iglesias and Kenley Jansen that have closing experience. They have late innings experience, and that's what the Jays need right now. I think Iglesias probably commands more of a closing role, but I think Jordan Romano has also earned his spot as the closer on that team, getting all MLB team votes. So those are two guys that I think really could supply the need at the back of the bullpen that the Jays kind of lacked this year. And then, of course, the Jays also lack solid and consistent left-handed pitching in that bullpen. And there's not a whole lot of big-name lefties on the free agent market this year, but Andrew Chafin is one of them. That I think he's the most intriguing left-handed pitcher in my opinion. He's a guy that was a huge get at the trade deadline after he had a brilliant start of the season with the Chicago Cubs. And I like him. I like the way he pitches. I like his stuff. He's a guy that I think could very well continue this. And I like him for more than just his mustache, too. He's got a brilliant mustache. And he looks 10 years older than he actually does. But I think he would be an interesting get of someone that I think with the need that the Jays have for top-end relief pitching, I think he fits that mold in almost a kind of a subtle way. He's not in your face like Jansen and Iglesias have been, but he's a guy that does fit a lot of needs for them. So that kind of does it here for what I think the Blue Jays should look at, guys I think they should look at, and basically what they're building with. As they've got a lot to build with, I think this is a team that's going to contend for the American League East next year. So we'll see. It's going to be an interesting offseason, a lot for them to do, a lot of questions to be answered, but ultimately they've got a few months to answer those questions.